Always love getting consent around the recording. Some good practice there. Hi, everybody. I'm Nabi Hussein. I'm the president of the Markup, and I am so excited to be joined here with Sarah and Paul. So Sarah and Paul are two people that really don't need any introduction, but besides their titles, I did want to highlight a couple of exciting things from their past that I think will be relevant to our conversation about journalism as a service, the intersection of service journalism and technology, and how that plays into sustainability questions and considerations. So Paul is the new-ish CEO of the Center for Public Integrity, which is the nation's oldest nonprofit news organization. And it's such an interesting pairing of this old, traditional, amazing news organization with someone of Paul's background who has been, I mean, I got to avail myself of his wisdom when he was at the Knight Foundation before this, thinking about sustainability, artificial intelligence, misinformation, all of these big, juicy questions at the intersection of journalism and technology. And he's been in all of the newsrooms, the big newsrooms you can recognize: NBC, the AP, Wall Street Journal, and Miami Herald. So I am especially excited to hear that perspective, thinking about foundations, for-profit sustainability, and now your experience at a legacy nonprofit, and how you're thinking about sustainability and service journalism. Sarah is, I have been so excited by Outlier for years now. I think, is this the 5-year anniversary of Outlier?
It is, but it's almost like year one because it's the first year we had any money.
Yay, so we should all clap for money. That's a good thing. That's why we're here talking about this stuff. But Outlier is just, I think, such a fascinating model of service journalism, of really centering the audience, of centering people's needs and setting that front and center in everything the organization does. And so Sarah, I didn't realize until I was, creeping on the internet that you are also a lawyer by training. I spent the last decade as a media lawyer, and now also I'm in journalism. But Sarah, you've also been at NPR, or the Michigan affiliate of NPR, had stuff in CIR, Detroit News, and the New York Times. So you're also familiar with traditional news, and now a scrappy, hyper-local nonprofit. So I think we have these different vantage points into these questions. And by way of my own background, as I mentioned, I am a lawyer by training, somehow stumbled into being the president of a news nonprofit that we launched in February 2020, right before many of our lives became mediated by technology more than we expected because of the global pandemic. And the Markup focuses on the various ways that technology is reshaping our society. So thinking about how we serve people as many folks wake up to the fact that, yeah, a big tech and technology in various ways does reshape our world is something that we think about all the time. So with that juicier background, it's clear that all three of our orgs do service journalism. It's clear that we do it in different ways, but I thought we could just take a couple of minutes to dig in a little bit about how our various institutions approach it. And Sarah, I thought I would start off with you.
Sure. So I think that not unlike a lot of terms in journalism, service journalism is one of those that gets thrown around and can mean a ton of different things. What I want Outlier to do, and what all of us here at Outlier want to be able to do, is to deliver very high value information to the people who need it most, right? I think that that's service journalism. I also think it's just good practice in journalism, right? I think it shouldn't necessarily be kind of ghettoized into this is just a little corner of journalism. I would love to see this view be more pervasive in journalism, that's what we should exist to do. But the way that we have conceived of doing this is to really try to look at our work in the ecosystem of Detroit to see what's not being done and who's not being served, and to try to fill those gaps, right? So we know that low-income Detroiters have been left out of kind of the ideal audience for most of the news organizations here, and that's done a tremendous amount of harm to them and to us as a city. And so what we're trying to do is serve that population. We're trying to serve low-income Detroiters, and we want to serve people in a way that is responsive to their needs, responsive to the information gaps, and just responsive in general. So we have a very low-tech system to do that. We use primarily text message because that's still a way that people want to receive information, importantly, and can receive information. So that's what we run. We run this SMS system. You can, I'll put it in the chat in a minute, but you can text the word Detroit to the short code 73224 if you want to see how that works and how responsive it is. And that's what we do to fill information gaps in Detroit, because there are many, right? Like and I'm sure I would love to actually hear what you all think about this, but the advent of kind of the internet and more accessible information on Google does not actually mean that information gaps are less severe or less prevalent. Just because the information exists on the internet does not mean it's getting to the people who need it, and does not mean it's verified. So a big part of our work is filling these information gaps day to day that really keep people from surviving and thriving. Things like, who really owns my house? Do I have to pay my taxes this year? How do I do it? How do I know if they're right, or if I've been overcharged by the city? How do I know if I really owe this money on my DTE bill, and if I know if these rates are fair? These are the kind of information gaps we're talking about. And then there's things like, where do I get food for my family, that we also started to do during the pandemic. When information isn't enough, which is often, because when there's big information gaps, accountability really suffers. So when information is not going to solve the problem, that's when we do very traditional kind of like watchdog journalism and some investigative journalism to try to close the accountability gaps that have risen up because there's these information gaps. So we're working with ProPublica on stories about utilities right now, and the high number of shutoffs and the very expensive rates that Detroiters are paying. We do a lot on city government. We run this Detroit Documenters program, which is a city bureau program that pays people and trains people to cover city meetings and really create a record, because that's not really being done by legacy newsrooms anymore because of the capacity. And and so we report primarily on housing, utilities, transportation, and we also, like I said, look at this as an ecosystem. We only want to stay in our lane. We only want to do what we know needs to be done because of the data collection that we've done and shows us where these information gaps are. And then we have one more kind of like tier that we run things through to figure out what we're going to cover. It needs to have showed up in our information needs assessments. So that's why we cover utilities, housing, and transportation. And we're also going to cover things that cause significant harm. If it's not causing a lot of harm, I don't think we need to spend our scarce resources on it. Like part of sustainability is like, how do you have enough money to do what you need to do? And then I think the other part is like, how do you conserve those resources? And how do you use what are always going to be scarce resources effectively? So we look at things and we are either going to cover things that cause widespread harm. So that's something like tax foreclosure, which affects most people here in the city. We're going to cover things that cause harm not to as many people, but the harm is extremely severe. So that's why we covered COVID in prisons during the pandemic, for example, because that's extreme harm and people are completely at the mercy of the state. And then we also cover things that are harmful to Detroiters and where that harm doesn't exist other places. I think tax foreclosure is actually an example of that too. Other places don't have huge tax foreclosure auctions and have had 150,000 houses sold in tax foreclosure since 2014, like us, right? So that's something, again, that we cover because it shows like there's an accountability gap in Detroit that doesn't exist other places. So what's going on here and what do we need to do about it? So that's our approach to service journalism, and we're extremely collaborative. We work with most of the news organizations here. We don't work with any TV stations yet, not for lack of trying. If anybody represents Detroit TV, we really want to work with you, because that's how people would like to have their information. But we're extremely collaborative. It's a practice. It's not always easy, but it's really important. Again, if we're thinking about sustainability, resource sharing and smart resource allocation just has to be part of that. And it's not going to happen unless people are collaborative. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. And it reminds me of when we were kicking off the markup, I had a funder say to me, sustainability is really smart choices. Like that's what it is, because you can't do everything. And so I love hearing about how intentional and thoughtful you've been about where you put your attention and when you decide to go it alone and when you decide to go with others. I wanted to pick up on the thread about, TV versus SMS. How did you guys decide to do SMS text approach early on? What went into that?
That was in 2015 when I was first developing Outlier. And so, like I said, I was really looking at, okay, if we're going to fill information gaps, it can't just be what type of information are you giving people, but how do people want to receive it? And the data, we have a very data-driven approach. Like the data was so clear that people did not have the data plans to support an app. People didn't, we didn't have the money at that point. We was me, and we had $70,000 for like the entire year and maybe forever. So it was clear that we weren't going to do TV. And I also think that, I wonder what you guys think about this too. Like, I also think that if you're going to start something, you want to start at the place that's most accessible, because once you do something fancy, you're never going to go back down, right? Like you're never going to go back and say like, oh, well, now let's go to a more general audience, right? Like it's always easier to go more niche and more niche and more niche. So we wanted to start somewhere that was like, let's make sure we're at least going to get the people who need us most. And then if it turns out that we should continue to segment, that's what we'll do. And we've done that. Like we have newsletters now, which I know that not all of our audience wants, but we'll never give up that broad-based tool. It might change. It might not always be SMS. I'd be surprised if it was always SMS, and we'll change it as soon as it makes sense. But I don't ever want to give up that tool that, people say like, this is the way that the majority of people say, this is the way that I want to get my information.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating channel, because text messages also feel more intimate, I think, than going into your inbox and getting a newsletter. There's something about where it's housed on your phone, and also the fact that it's a very directional, like you need this information now, that also feels like that could prime an audience to really relate to the work that you're doing and really identify with it. And I'm sure that has great benefits when it comes to sustainability, which we'll pick up on in a couple of questions. But Paul, I wanted to turn to you. I mean, you have seen the journalism industry from so many fascinating vantage points, right? Like the big traditional organizations for profit, then as a funder, and now at CPI. I'm curious about how you think about, sort of the Paul philosophy of service journalism and how you're seeing that unfold at CPI.
I mean, I think, so first I've been at CPI for maybe about 100 days. And so for those who are not familiar with CPI, basically, the Center for Public Integrity, we seek to reverse the corrosive effects of inequity by holding powerful interests accountable and equipping the public with knowledge to drive change. So we are independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit. We are dedicated all of our resources to investigate these systems and circumstances that contribute to inequity through our country's past, present, and future. Now, what is really important about service journalism is, how does that relate to your mission? So we have actually gone through, for the past months, sort of looking at sort of our mission and really asked ourselves the question is, who is it we are serving? And we quickly understand that through history, through CPI's founding, we are very much a B2B player. A lot of our content is actually through partnership, right? And so when we think about service journalism, we start thinking about the framework of what is B2B, meaning journalism to journalism, and then B2C, journalism to consumer or the public. And then the other axis that I'm sort of layering in is national versus local, right? And so when we start thinking about the service journalism, you have to ask yourself, like, what is your capacity? And in what way does these capacity express themselves in these different quadrants? So for example, traditionally, when we did the Criminalizing Kids series, we curate data from every single state because we actually have an in-house lawyer. I'm not a lawyer like Navia and Sarah, I wish I was. But we have an in-house lawyer that actually sue different states for FOIA access, for data access. So when we curate the data, that's a skill set that we have. But what we did with that data set is when we compile it, we actually work with, we did office hour with other news outlet, with our other partners to show them, here's how you could use the data and localize it. Here's the analysis that we could glean. So to me, that's a very much like B2B, like local service, right? Like at the end of the day, the way we want to equip the public, we want to equip the public with the knowledge to drive change is through our partnerships, right? It's through our partners' ability to contextualize this data set for local, right? So now we are not distracted because it's mission aligned, and it's also a capacity that we have, right? We have the lawyer, we got the data journalist who's able to put that together, right? So I think, the other things that we want to think about in terms of capacity and service is, what is it that we could do that's in a way not extractive, right? So we did a partnership with the Washington Informer, which is a Black-owned local newspaper here in DC. And basically, we are not the grantee. We got funding from Google's GNI, where the money went into the Washington Informer. And CPI, the Center for Public Integrity, is the subcontractor. We're the subgrantee where we did the data work for them, that we are actually working on sort of gentrification stories here in DC. So again, we sort of think about what is the skill sets that we have that we could sort of, leverage into potential sustainability models, right? And sometimes it's so easy to think about sort of like, oh, I could create this data set, how could I monetize it? But the more that we sort of look into our history and the more we think about what the future can be, is the data set itself has a value. But what we realize is the talent and capacity that we built over time, that is the thing that we could monetize. And time again, as I see sort of where CPI is heading, we see that as being a resource. Now, when I think about the field, the word service journalism is kind of wonky, right? Because I think, like Sarah said, like we just throw that word around. If anyone watch, like Liz Lemon, like we just throw words around like as if it meanings, right? So I think part of this is we want to really answer like, what is service mean to you and how does it relate to your mission and for whom you're serving, right? Because if you're doing a B2B service, that's very different than a B2C service. So as we're thinking about, what is service journalism for us from a sort of like from a journalism to public, again, it might not be about like, we have this data set and we're going to throw it out and expect the public to do something about it. This is something that we did prior to me getting to CPI, that we partnered with a local epidemiologist about COVID. And what we end up doing is equipping that local epidemiologist with our data, with our journalism. And she was able to do a Facebook event with our information, because she has a following that is trusted, right? People don't know who we are. People don't necessarily trust us, but they trust this expert. So as I'm thinking about sort of, again, how do we monetize? I want to make sure that we think about, what is that service to you? Is it a thing like a data set? Or is it a service that you could provide, or an experience that you could provide? And for whom you're providing this experience for is also really important. Otherwise, you sort of be wasting your time doing things that's not part of sort of your core, and you end up trying something that will have very little return on investment, and it doesn't add any value for anybody.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear you talk about the gradations of people that you serve and how thoughtful you are there, and also about it's not just monetization, sustainability, it's actually creating value, and that has downstream, feedback loops to sustainability in the way that we narrowly think about it, like dollars in hand, but thinking about how do you create value for your audiences, plural, right? Whether that's people who are consuming your news, partners in the industry, partners in other industries, is a really, that value-based approach also seems like it lends itself to generating trust in the org quite well, right? And in a time where not everyone trusts journalists, I think both of you are experimenting with really thoughtful ways of developing that. That was a question that was so front and center when we were launching the Markup. Where like launching a new news organization is all wild as its own endeavor. To do so in this environment of blah, blah, fake news, historic low trust in journalism, felt like we needed to think about what was our trust proposition from day one, and baking that into the services that we provide. And Paula, I want to stick with the sort of B2B, B2C framework that you picked up, because that maps on perfectly to how we think about our approach at the Markup. So on the sort of B2C frame, we were like, okay, we all use technology, right? That became very clear in March 2020. We're all like learning new tools that become our sort of lifeline to the rest of the world. But we don't often understand, even if a tool is free, that it may be costly in other ways, right? That there are exchanges of data and transparency and your privacy needs that are being transacted that you don't know about. We thought, okay, one really tangible way that we can serve the public in this moment is explaining that. And let's explain it in a way that directly answers questions. So we launched a series called Ask the Markup. And so when people asked questions like, how good is Zoom? Like, should I be worried about it? We were able to answer that. Or when people said, what is the deal with Venmo? Why can I see everyone's transaction? We're like, we're going to meet you where you are, and we're going to answer that. So you surface questions and we answer them. And that's a pretty clear, tangible service. And I think for me, one of the proudest moments of doing this for us was we had a story and then did an Instagram live the morning of the first big racial justice George Floyd protests in Brooklyn. And it was, how do I protect my phone when I go to a protest? So like understanding what the moment is, what questions might bubble up in that moment, and then saying, we have expertise, let's leverage it for you right now when you need it, was, one B2C approach of thinking about service and how we could create value in that moment. Now, a huge reason that the Markup was founded was to do sort of very innovative, data intensive, investigative journalism. And that, prompted a different set of questions, right? Which is like, if you're going to invest significant resources in doing these kinds of investigations, how do we make sure we're maximizing not only potential for impact, right? Potential for change is why we all get out of bed in the morning, but also who we're serving. Because if you serve people, much like the epidemiologist example, right? If you put information into the right hands of someone, they can go on and do things with it. And that is how you generate impact at scale. And so for us, for our investigations, we'll publish, these deep data-rich methodologies that are meant to serve other news organizations that have data journalists, researchers, academics, regulators who care about different accountability methods and practices. And then we also launched direct to the public tools. So one that we launched just about a year ago with over 2 million uses so far was something called Blacklight, where we used Blacklight is an almost real-time privacy inspector. It tells you when you go to any website, if you go to purinadogfood.com, what is the information that they're getting from you in this interaction where you thought you were just searching for dog food. And we use it to power a big investigation of ours as sort of the phase one of that tool. The phase two was opening it up to people that we thought had relative sophistication in how the tool was being used, so software developers and other folks. And then a phase three was really amplifying it to the public to say, hey, do you want to know what happens when you go to dogfood.com or Girl Scouts or whatever? Use this to put the tools of journalistic inquiry in your own hands and then make good, savvy choices accordingly. And these are all sort of different ways that we've experimented with in the last 2 years of thinking about service. And I think we're still in our early days of measuring which ones strike the right sustainability balance, right? So answering people's questions that they send to you via email or via social is one lift. Generating and building $1 million tool to do something is an entirely different calculus. And every org kind of figures out like how, what the right balance is for the moment that you're serving. But I want to take that and come back to you guys about how you think about the service journalism factoring into your business when it comes to just allocation of staff, right? How do you think about staff time for these different things, especially when you're launching a new experiment, when you might not know if something is a push into a new realm? What are the metrics that you set up to assess how successful it's going to be if all of sustainability is making smart choices? And I might go to you, Sarah, because you started with SMS and then you built into sort of partnerships from there. What were you thinking about during that expansion?
Well, I will say, while I've become like less rabid on the business part of journalism. I used to push back every single time, and I've become a little bit like softer. But I do think that, we have to always in this industry be really conscious about how poor the likelihood of success is, right? Like how improbable it is, right? Like it is very rare that a news organization is going to be successful in financial terms right now. And it's like, it's probable that we won't even survive. So given that, I think that you have to be service oriented and you have to be impact oriented, whether or not it's sustainable, because, or you only have a few years, maybe. And so you better do well. I just don't think that to build first to be sustainable and then hope to start doing impact, those years of impact aren't promised to you. So you need to start knowing that you're going to be as impactful as you can with the resources that you have. So I do think that that's like part of how we look at things. But when we were finally able to think about adding value, I actually think we did what both of you all did. Like our first hire outside of me, and I wasn't getting paid, so I was a hire, but not really. Like I was getting barely paid, was a data journalist. And the reason why is because we needed someone who could build these different tools that could be translated in different ways. And again, like what's a smart buy? It's something that you can like repackage many ways. It could have different audiences. And a lot of that right now is to build, databases, scrapers, things that can be utilized in different ways by different people, our news consumers, but also partners. And we want to provide value to the ecosystem all the time because, again, for sustainability, we would be in deep trouble if the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press closed tomorrow or next year. At the same time, it's possible that one of them, is going to go out of business soon. The newspaper business is in trouble. So in the time that we have, we want to try to help to shore up the value that everybody is providing in the ecosystem. So that's what we're trying to do, is provide tools that will keep us valuable, that people are going to do cost sharing with us. We do get a lot of cost sharing from our partners. That's super important. That's one thing we do. And then the things that we're really trying to push as tools are our info needs study. And that's something that we want people to pay us to do for them. But it's also because it's not just because we can bring in revenue, it's because we think that if people did these info needs studies in their communities and really found out what was it that people needed, that if they built a news system that was responsive to that, it would be so beneficial to their community. So it's not just, well, what can we maybe bring some money in? It's like, what needs to happen? And is there a way that we could bring some sustainability to us so that we can continue to provide that service? And then I think there's things that are less expensive. Staff is always expensive, but when we hired, and they should be paid well, because again, how many years do we have So you can't pay someone really poorly if you can't guarantee them employment for a very long period of time. So when we brought in a reporter this year, he also came along with a newsletter and with an established audience that we can then start to raise money from right away to do the rest of the work, right? When we bring in documenters, it already has a system that has shown its value. It has a way to convince people that this is like a virtuous cycle and that they should give money into it. And so I think that that's also something to think about, is like, how do you bring in these products that can help you, if you can, if you can make the case for your value, these products can help you get the word out and bring revenue back in.
It's so savvy, right? To think about how you can draw on audiences that already exist instead of always having to start your own from scratch. Because that, of course, does take a lot of time and a lot of energy and effort to start from zero. So I think that's very savvy. Now, Paul, you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective. CPI, of course, has been around for a very long time. You've been in a lot of newsrooms that have those dedicated audiences already, but that doesn't mean that, thinking about how you budget in and think about the sort of factoring in this kind of service into your business plan doesn't mean that it's still top of mind for you. How do you think about these questions?
I mean, I think when we think about sort of monetization and business sustainability, first we sort of, and I know because, for a while, like everyone is talking about like the new business model of journalism. I just want to say there's only a finite way that anyone can make money, right? Like it's not this infinite ways, right? Like you make money from advertising, sponsorship, grants, or like direct from consumer, right? Like, donation or subscribership, right? Or sometimes you could do a consultancy service. So let's sort of acknowledge, unless there's some other magical way for any business to make money, I'm not even talking about journalism, right? Like any business to make money right now is finite. So I think part of us, we have to think about, with these finite path of making money, what is it we're doing to maximize the work that we have, right? So I think that's something that like journalism are traditionally bad at, right? So for example, like CPI, like over the history of CPI, how many data set did CPI actually build because they did the data for a particular investigation? But once that investigation is done, that data set no longer get maintained. And so therefore we cannot have downstream value of that data. So that's a lost opportunity, right? So as we think about, the opportunity is sort of like, is in the work that you do, what is it that will have a long tail and what is it that you could sunset? And I don't know if, many of us are thinking about it. I remember when I was at the AP and even at the Miami Herald, when I was at the Miami Herald, one things that we did that I thought it was really short-sighted is the Miami Herald had one of the most extensive archive about Miami, right? Miami is not like, it hasn't has the same history as New York. So for a paper of record, they actually have these historic document, but we sold the entire archive for someone else, right? So to me, that's a really short-sighted like way of managing like your asset, right? So that means there's no way for you to monetize your historic photos or historic knowledge for future content IP, right? And so at the AP, they are able to monetize that archive, right? AP photos, right? Like, AP videos. And think about all these documentaries, entertainment that have these references. So they are able to rethink the content that we create today, the AP create today, to have that longer tail value. So what does that mean for a place like CPI? So, a couple of years ago, we developed this tool called copy and paste legislation. Basically, it's a plagiarism detection tool that we realized that a lot of the sort of state legislation, they actually copy off each other. So we did this to do that one investigation. So now we're looking back at what is it that we could do with this tool to have a longer value? Is there a way for the tool that we could equip the public to do something with it. So I think, a lot of these times is like, how do we maximize the product that we have, that we already produce, that we ignore, right? And it's hard for journalists to think that way because we do one story and then we sort of move on, right? So, going back to like, what do we do with the content and how is that content relevant now or in the future? I think that's where there's a good amount of opportunities there, right? Because I'm thinking about, are there content IP that we could resurface from the past that we haven't done before? And again, recognize that there's only limited way for us to make money.
Yeah, I remember you saying that to me, I think when I started at the Markup and you were at Night, where like there's only some lanes. You got to pick a couple of lanes that you're willing to play in. And it does require creativity within those lanes, right? Whether it's selling off a tool for its IP, looking at the IP of stories that you have and understanding if there's a life cycle there, whether it's Hollywood or licensing to academic journals or whatever it is. But I think having the creativity and the time really to just stop and look at your assets and say, okay, are we making the most out of this? Seems like it's not always a luxury that early stage places have, but you need it to make it past those few years, Sarah, that you mentioned. There is one other wrinkle that I wanted to get into in terms of the different lanes that can offer funding, and that's thinking about how revenue generating efforts are received by philanthropy. Right. And so in many of my conversations with prospective supporters and funders, they want to see that you're taking efforts to create value, that you are trying to play in these different lanes. I think it can be I think of it often as it's one form of audience feedback, right? So even if you don't get a ton of money, right? Even if you're not moving millions from individual donations, it is a feedback loop of people who identify the value in your work, right? And then it's useful even for that. And then it's also useful to be able to leverage into other conversations with folks in philanthropy and with major donors. But I'm curious for how you both think about that. And maybe I'll start with you, Sarah.
Well, I think we're trying to, again, I've gotten better. But there's a reason that like Candace does these conversations and not me, usually with funders. So I do think that is important. It took us a minute to get there because we just didn't have capacity, right? Like there was no one to like do that. There was no one to raise money, but now we have a development director and it's amazing. Chelsea Brown, she's great. But I think that the other thing is that we have to, like Paul and you were both saying, there's only a couple of lanes here. If you are creating a high value, especially for an audience that does not necessarily have a lot of money, I think we also have to be honest about like the need for subsidy. Like some of this work is going to need to be subsidized, whether by philanthropy or whatever, but it needs to be subsidized, but we should still be careful with that subsidy. It doesn't mean that like you should just get whatever you want and you assume that nobody, it's like college, like because it's subsidized, it gets to cost like $1 million because everybody's taking out loans. So I do think though that having an impact tracker that tracks like the value of the work that you do in lots of different ways is one way to help both a news organization and a funder be on the same, like have the same conversation about like what's worth funding, how much money do we need? And even if we're not going to be able to create monetary value in a certain tool, it might still be worth it. So for a newsletter, yes, I think that should have donations because is it creating a ton of impact or a ton of value? I'm not sure. For the text message system, do I think it needs to be subsidized? Yes, because it's not necessarily going to be able to bring in donations through that system. And we're going to have to think of some other way. So I think that like, it's not a magic bullet. It's really like, do you know what you're doing? And do you know the impact that it's having? And can you have conversations about those smart choices or those tough choices, right? And I do know that Resolve Philly, because this is like a Philly centered thing. I knew that Resolve Philly's impact tracker is great. And we are kind of trying to model our impact tracker off of theirs. And Lindsay Green Barber at Impact Architects is also amazing and does a lot of work around this. So I do think that that's extremely important, knowing what you're doing and what impact it has and how much money you should be able to ask for in subsidy.
Yeah, I think it's really smart too to think about different pieces of what you produce as having sort of different sustainability needs. Like, I think that was such a crisp way of putting it. Some things, if you're going to do them, they got to be self-sustaining or have a pathway to being self-sustaining. And other things are just ambitious enough bets or so core to the value that you're creating every day that they need support. And I like I love Resolve. I love that impact tracker template is amazing. It's like a gift that keeps giving, I think, across this industry. And so, yeah, impact is value especially for nonprofit journalism. Like that's what we're here to do. Paul?
I think, especially as a former funder, I think when we use the word funder, that's also really funny because we sort of put every funder in this ubiquitous category. And I think, part of what we need to do better is looking at sort of like the funder, like market segmentation, right? There's some funders who will care about sort of like, the topic that you do. So they're not journalism, but they want to know how you use journalism to advance or solve a particular societal issue, right? And then there's funders who care about how do we modernize or transform the field of journalism. Those two funders are completely different funders, right? They're not the same, and you shouldn't treat them the same. And based on that, and also thinking about sort of your organization, you have to not fall into some myth, right? So for example, there's this whole myth with, and I say myth in terms of like subscribers and membership, right? Not every single journalism organization will be supported by subscribership, right? For some place like CPI, where we're not, like most of the public don't know who we are. Most of the public get our content through partnership, right? Or if you are in a community where is economically challenged, like it's okay to say like, look, like membership and subscribership is a part, but they're not there to be your main revenue driver. In fact, those numbers actually validate, the justification why you exist and why there's a need for you. And so I think it's really sort of right sizing, sort of like the thing that you're producing to the proper expectation of revenue, right? For us, philanthropy will always be in the picture, but do we want it to be like 90% of our budget? No, right? So how do we right size that? And what is the right size is something that I think is important for each one of us to sort of go through, right? And some places, like if you are at, a place like, the New York Times and Texas Tribune, right? Like there's a lot of people in Texas, right? So it is possible that you could be supported by membership. But if you are in a rural community, like, well, your market base is your market base, then what other ways do you have to support that, right? So I think it's sort of like, don't let some of these, like sort of industry conversation push you to a place where you shouldn't be there from the get-go, right? Like we're not going to do advertising and we will never do advertising, and we're okay with that. But it doesn't mean that we can't seek out sponsorships and other means of support, but you sort of have to be really direct, and you can't expect the funder to understand that. I think, as something that I appreciate as a former funder, the more direct someone is and honest to the point, the better it is. Because like, I would see people used to pitch me like, we want to partner. We think we could grow this into a business. I'm just like, well, how? Like they have no data to back up that this is a viable business. And it's saying that like the viable business is for us to continue to get, philanthropic support, but we need to use your fund as catalytic funding to tap into local philanthropy. Like that, I could buy as a reasonable answer, but you can't just like make things up. So I think part of this is really understanding sort of like the type of funders that you have, and also really understand like what is it you're producing, and in so many finite way where you're going to get that money, and really sort of like double down on those methods.
Yeah, I think it's so smart to create that sort of taxonomy of different funders. There's a great observation in the chat that neighborhood funding doesn't have the same interest as a foundation program officer, in part because everyone's also, they're coming to your work at sort of different levels. A neighborhood funder who maybe started off giving you $5 a month and then sees the repeated value, the repeated impact, has a very different narrative of what they're sustaining, what the value is, than a program officer who may be interested in giving you catalytic funding to help you take something off. And that's, I think, having more discipline in those conversations is really important, and can be, I have found sometimes challenging, right? When everyone's like running around doing different things, and it's like, yes, there's a wealth of good ideas, but if we have to sit down and have those sort of tough choices and say, okay, not only do we want to do this, but what's the sustainability story here, right? What's the 1 year, the 2 year, the 3 year? Is this something that is supported by the masses, supported by 5 people who really care about it? Or is this something that needs, like, you know, the way that VC funding operates in the for-profit sector? Like, those are structured conversations that can sometimes be hard to see when you're in the mix, and also operating on life cycles that feel like, are we even going to make it 5 years? To Sarah, to your point earlier, right? To like really introduce the discipline of saying, even if you're not sure if you're going to make it that long, you have to have at least plan as if you're going to, especially with sophisticated funders, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I would say some good idea for someone is not necessarily a good idea for you, right? Because I think there is this momentum where like, this is the thing that worked, like, you know, oh, philanthropy is funding like these labs, like education lab, like homeless lab. So everyone's suddenly doing like labs, right? Like, well, that only work in some scenario. It's not going to work everywhere, right? Just like subscription model is not going to work for everybody. And I think it's time for us to actually just be honest and say like, no, this is not for me. And here's why. But you have to like have good reasons and good data to back up the why.
At the same time, I will say, as one of those people who was pretty honest at the beginning of like, I don't know, how is this going to make money? Probably not. Like, I have no idea, right? Like, it's going to take us a while to figure out sustainability because we started with nothing. I do think that funders were really resistant to it. And I think that, you know, speaking for like the little guys, like the local startups, a lot of those people are starting with very little money, and yet the expectation is still that they have a sustainability plan, and that is unreasonable, right? It's unreasonable for people to be able to build a product that has value and a sustainability strategy. You kind of, if you're really small and you don't have a lot of funds, you kind of have to pick one. But I do think that funders don't often acknowledge that, right? They want to see if you can do both. And it really feels kind of like, it feels difficult to be honest about that, you know? And I think that there's more money available for people who are like, yes, I can build a sustainability strategy, rather than, yes, I can build a product that will be valuable to my community.
I think when I think about that is, I think about my parents who own a small Chinese business, right? Like, you know, first we have to ask like, what is sustainability mean to us? Because I think when we hear sustainability from funder and we hear sustainability, somehow we're thinking about this. I think it's because so many journalists who start their own come from these big newsrooms. We think like we need like a newsroom of like 100+ people, and that's sustainability. When I think about my parents, it's like, look, they have a Chinese restaurant with like 3 people, and sustainability means for them to like be able to pay all the bills and pay themselves a salary, and that's sustainability, right? So when I think about journalism, it's like, if you are like a food truck, like what is the sustainability model for a food truck versus a individual restaurant versus a chain of restaurants versus a franchise? And I don't think we often sort of differentiate that kind of conversation. In journalism, we say sustainability, and immediately I think we jump to like, you know, we got to be like
It's
the
growth that
Washington
they
Post
really
or New York
mean.
Times.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think if it's this general theme of like, you got to know your lane, right? And your lane may be that you are the food truck of news organizations, and that is fine, right? Food trucks are delicious. You don't need to be a huge brick and mortar institution to torture that metaphor. But I will say, like, as someone, you know, I'm 2 years into the markup, it is hard to have those really really blunt conversations with funders, because and this again goes to sort of taxonomy of different types of funders. There are funders who will say, we're going to take the bet on what you're doing, and that's fine, and go, like, Godspeed and go try. And there's others that are like, I want 17,000 different metrics of success, and I want you to report out on them every quarter. And it's hard to say, this is an act of fiction. Like, we can talk about all of these metrics, but is this really getting to what you want? What are you really making an investment for? And is even the language of investment always appropriate in the way it's being deployed here when we're talking about value and impact as part of the bottom line? This isn't about just having dollars. And I want to make sure we have 6 minutes left, and I want to make sure I tap on some of the questions that are in the chat. And there's picking up on this theme, there's an interesting question about how we describe public service journalism to funders, and do they always want to hear the word investigative? There's also a comment a little bit lower saying, you know, seriously, don't get into pretzel twists for funders, and those feel like interrelated observations. Do you feel like you have to explain service as you know, of course, service doesn't mean the same thing to different people. How have those conversations been with your funders, explaining exactly what your service is and exactly what the value is, even if that doesn't, you know, mean that you're showing that you're making money in a short period of time?
I tend to think about it like, what is the problem we are solving and what is our solution, right? And you know, our solution is journalism. So it's sort of like, if I'm talking to a funder about, this is how we going to reverse, you know, the corrosive effects of inequity. And our tactic is through journalism. And here's where journalism fit in the overall solution set of reversing the effects of inequity, right? So I think it's sort of contextualizing what you do to the problem, and not like, and I have to remind people, like, don't sell journalism. Most people don't really care. I'm sorry to say, most people don't care,
It's
right?
so
Like,
true. So
they care
true.
about the problem, and journalism is a way of highlighting, exposing, and making the problem relevant, right? So I think that's the part we have to focus on, is like, what is the problem you're solving, and how is it that you're going to solve it, and what is your track record of solving it, right? So I think if you sort of focus on that, and it doesn't matter what type of funders you're talking to, right? Like, if we're talking about a tool, then I could pitch that tool to, you know, journalism funder, because I'm solving a problem that the field is having. And then if I'm talking to topic-based funders, then I'm solving, you know, the you know, whatever the topic that's important to the funder. So I would say, like, don't get too fancy, but really focus on, like, what is the problem and what is the solution, and where do you fit in the solution set, right? Because literally in my past job, like, there were people who say, I'm going to fix the whole problem misinformation with $200,000. I'm like, no, you won't. Like, but if you tell me you could you know, deal with this little corner of it, then yeah, I could buy that. So I also think, like, it's okay to say, like, you're not going to fix the entire problem, but this is where you fit in the solution set. I think knowing your place and knowing your lane is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think in my experience with funders, I think there's a lot of trust building that comes in saying, I'm not going to solve all of your problems. I'm going to solve this piece of it. And also stating, like, what you think the theory of change is, right? Which is, like, part of the theory of change is directing your attention to a problem that you didn't know about. Right. And that's really, really valuable, because if you tell me you care about hunger, right, and, like, that's what you care about as a funder, I think about the Amartya Sen quote that, like, there's never been famine in a place with a robust press. Like, we can direct your attention to the fact that that is a problem, so you can pay attention to it, and that alone makes us part of your theory of change. And like explaining it in that way to say, so the metrics you're going to get at the end isn't necessarily that we've had all of this sort of tangible impact in the way that you might count if you funded a food bank. It's still really important because this is the lane that we have, and that's necessary. So we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to take a quick peek in the chat to see if there's any other. Oh, there's a great suggestion that there's an episode of The Hidden Brain that talks about how much we focus on adding fuel to solve a problem for an audience versus reducing friction. I think that that's really smart. We have just 2 minutes left. So if Paul, Sarah, if you want to offer any final words to wrap things up on journalism as a service and sustainability, we can give everyone a couple minutes back.
Yeah, I would say the secret is there's more of us than there are funders, and they need us because they literally cannot be everywhere. So we are that insight. We often point out things that they don't know. So like, just know that like we have just as much power. They have the money, but we actually know what's going on.
Yeah. And I just think building journalism as a service is important, and being sustainable is great, but if you're sustainable and you're not providing a service, then what does it matter? You know?
Totally. I think one piece I definitely want to take from this is thinking about not only your own sustainability, but sustainability across the industry. Like we talked about partnerships and collaboration so much at the top of the hour. And I think, you know, we're all trying to make it in this together, and thinking about that B2B aspect feels like that fits into the lane and solution set analogy that you were bringing up, Paul. Like if we all pick our lane and own it very clearly and then collaborate with each other on cross lanes in this highway, we're going to be able to be part of that solution set for funders. And I think being in conversation with each other like this panel is a great step towards that. So thank you to LenFest for having us. Thank you for the good questions. Thank you, Sarah and Paul, for your—
You too. This is great.
Yeah, this was so much fun. Thanks, everybody. And we're right at 3:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Amazing presentation. I just wanted to remind everybody before you go that the last session for the day, our final keynote, is going to be at 4 p.m. So make sure you don't miss it. It is about community-focused journalism, so really great conversation, similar to the one we were having just now. Thank you again for everyone for attending. Have a great day.